Hi, folks. Steve Urban here. Today's episode of the Riderflex podcast is sponsored by Marketing 360. My good friend JB Kellogg and his team do such a fantastic job for us and so many other companies. Marketing 360 is the number one platform for small business, and it's everything you need to grow your business. If you need marketing support, I really encourage you to contact them at marketing360.com/Riderflex, and we'll add that link to the description of this episode for easy reference. On today's episode of the Riderflex podcast, we are pleased and honored to have guest Barbara T. Bauer. She's the director of the Women's Investor Network at Rockies Venture Club, an experienced executive with large and small organizations, now working directly with entrepreneurs and angel investors. Barbara Bauer on the Riderflex podcast today. How you doing, Barbara?
I'm great. Glad to be on. Thank you for having me.
It's an honor, really. A privilege to have you here. Outstanding career. I mean, all anybody has to do is, look you up on LinkedIn and look at your profile and go, wow, okay, let's ask her for some advice. So appreciate you being here. So for the listeners, real quick, how about some personal background? Maybe where you grew up, some family stuff, and then where you went to school, things like that, before we get into the professional world.
Absolutely. I grew up in Northwest Missouri in a very small town, so it was sort of the classic Leave It to Beaver upbringing, where I knew everyone in town. And I can remember telling my mom one day I was going to run away, and she said, well, go ahead. Betty and Sally will let me know where you are in town anyway.
That's pretty good. That's pretty good. How many people in your graduating class, for high school, do you remember?
About 100, I think.
100? Okay. Pretty small town. All right.
Yeah, I think the town was about 10,000 in those days.
Gotcha. All right. All right. What'd your folks do?
My father worked for the Department of Agriculture, the Farmers Home Administration. And so in the summer times, I would go with him on visits to farm families where he would assess their crop potential and work with them on their books and budgets. And I learned to drive by driving his old Pontiac on those farms.
How about that? That's pretty cool. All right. Yeah. Any siblings?
One sister who was a year older.
Okay. All right. And your mother, stay-at-home mom, or what'd she do?
She was a kindergarten teacher until children were born, and then she was a stay-at-home mom, but I think remained a kindergarten teacher actually through her entire life.
Oh, is that okay?
Yeah, which was really good because I got the benefit of all that, how to help a kindergarten kid actually learn and be prepared for life. So it was a good experience.
Okay, very good. And then somehow you decided to major in physics. You must have been super smart in high school, right? You like a 4.0. I mean, talk to me about it.
I always did get good grades, and in high school in particular, I really loved math and science. And so I went to college at a Jesuit university, St. Louis University, and I remember in my freshman class, my sister was a year older, and she was also going to that university, and she was literally the perfect student. So when I was in my freshman algebra class, the professor said, "Oh, Barbara, are you Jane's sister?" And I thought, okay, I'm dead meat here, because she got an A on literally everything.
Wow.
And so I had thought about majoring in math, but given that she was majoring in math, I said, okay, can't do that. This isn't going to work. And so I thought, okay, I'll major in physics. It's much better than chemistry. Chemistry is messy. Organic chemistry was way too, difficult. Yeah. I thought physics, was actually easier, and I really liked it. So
okay. When did you know what you wanted to do? I mean, so when you decided that, were you thinking, okay, I want to be, career-wise, did you have a plan?
No. And certainly in those days, 1,000 years ago, the options for women were secretary, nurse, and teacher. And I was confident that I didn't have the patience to be a nurse. I probably didn't have the appropriate interpersonal skills to be a secretary. So a teacher was probably what I thought might happen.
I see.
But by the time I got through undergraduate school, I decided to go to graduate school. And so I went to get a master's in physics at the University of Kansas. And when I finished that master's degree and started interviewing for jobs, I realized that, I mean, during the master's degree, it was clear to me that theoretical physics was going to be much more suitable for me than doing some sort of laboratory experiment. I think I nearly electrocuted several of my lab instructors in those days. I would always partner up with some guy who was in double E, and I would write up the theory of the experiment, and he would actually hook the stuff together. I can't screw in light bulbs.
I see. Okay. That's pretty good.
And so when I finished, as part of the master's thesis, of course, if you're doing any kind of research work in physics or other sciences, you are automatically using computational technology. And so I got interested in software technology, and when I finished my master's degree, decided to get a PhD in computer science.
Ah,
And in those days, the PhD programs in computer science were fairly new. They frequently were quite hardware based. So you might come out of an engineering program into that kind of PhD program.
I see.
And I had a wonderful thesis advisor. I was at the University of Kansas, and I was doing a research project called Generalized Homomorphisms of Finite State Automata, and I could not begin to tell you at all right now what that was all about.
That's pretty good.
But I ended up at that time also getting married and moving with my husband, who had been in graduate school in physics with me,
Okay.
to New Jersey, and we both worked for Bell Laboratories.
Ah, so that was okay. Wow. Now, had you been to the East Coast before that from St. Louis?
I had traveled a lot. My parents were dedicated travelers, and so
okay.
I, of course, had been to New York and Boston and
Okay.
Atlantic City. Had never lived there, and so it was quite different.
Well, yeah, yeah, especially back then. But you, at least it wasn't complete shock. You had been in the area before. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, very good. Went to work for Bell. Okay, and then so kind of give us the, kind of walk us through a little bit of your career and then into, some of the things you're doing now. Just give us a little history and into some of the stuff you're doing now, and obviously, talk about the boards you're on and RVC,
Yeah.
but a little early career first, if you don't mind.
Not at all. I mean, the experience at Bell Labs was wonderful because Bell Labs hired smart people. And most of my colleagues there had masters or PhDs, and so it was a heady intellectual environment. But after a while, it was clear to me that I actually wanted to do something that had more practical applications. And so as the Bell system was breaking up, I decided to find a job in one of the operating companies.
Okay.
And US West at the time was starting an organization called Advanced Technologies. And so I was one of, I think, the first 25 employees in that advanced technology organization.
Wow.
And there was one other sort of interesting anecdote around that. When I did the interview, I was really interested in the job, and I was pretty clear that they thought I would be a suitable candidate. And I said, but I'm actually now separated, almost divorced. I have a child. If you're going to hire me, I have a trailing ex-spouse, because I wouldn't separate my child,
I see.
halfway across the country.
Gotcha.
Unfortunately, my ex-husband has a very similar background, PhD in physics. And he was maybe the 26th employee at Advanced Technology. So we both moved out here, and that way we could share custody with Matt.
I see. And that's when you moved to Denver.
Right.
Gotcha. Okay. No pressure. No pressure for your son with both parents having PhDs. No pressure or anything.
Yes, and, I think for a long time he
uh,
was pretty clear that we worked too hard and we weren't that interesting. So maybe he'd do something differently. And he did end up working in a very deeply analytic field. So he's a portfolio analyst for large portfolio companies.
I see. Okay. Well, I'm sure you're super proud of him. You have grandchildren?
No grandchildren, a very small dog that everyone's very fond of.
Okay, very good. So then, yeah, walk us into, obviously you became an executive. You had several executive roles. Talk to me a little bit about what it was like to enter into a leadership executive role back when, you know, the percentage of women being in those roles was even tinier than it is now. What was that like? I'd love to hear a couple of experiences and what that was like for you.
Well, from graduate school on, I was always in a fully male environment, and usually the only female. Um,
Wow.
and and I can remember going to meetings at US West with the network organization, and because of the role I had at Advanced Technologies, I was frequently in those meetings with network vice presidents. When that was definitely a very old boys club. And so it was just a matter of knowing my stuff, um, being sure that I was on point relative to what the priorities and needs were of that very male dominated organization. And it was a wonderful experience, actually.
Oh,
I
good.
mean, there certainly was lots of, if I were to go back and list all the forms of discrimination, there were lots, but it was also a tremendous opportunity to learn from people who were so deeply experienced in this particular industry sector. And one of the things that was so impressive to me at the time, telephone companies rise to challenges. And I think maybe the first year or two I was in Colorado, there was a flood. And of course, telephone lines and everything else were destroyed. And it was a wonderful opportunity to see this very large and complex organization really put their resources to bear on solving immediate and urgent
Mm,
problems.
mm,
And, whereas in big organizations, there are always uh, situations that cause tension, the telephone companies were a great example of how people pulled together to achieve a common objective and just got rid of all those turf wars or political
really,
issues.
really. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. You know, as I looked at as I looked at your career and the timeline of your career, I thought about, you know, just kind of where you were and what was happening in life, I guess at those times. And I was comparing it in my head. I was thinking about what it must have been like to be a female executive back. I'll use the TV show Mad Men that I watched. And I remember watching Mad Men, and I remember thinking, my God, is that really how it was? Like, that's really how women were treated I mean, really? In my head, I was like, surely some of this is fictional. Was it really that bad? I want to know from you, was it that bad, or talk to me. I'm just curious.
I can give you a funny example that shows it really was that bad, but then I'm going to counter that with some other
Okay.
examples of
Okay.
what happened. Uh, in between getting my bachelor and master's degree, I actually worked for IBM in Kansas City, Missouri. And I was with a team, and there was a lead salesman, and I was a systems engineer that supported the technical
Okay.
work. And there was an opportunity to do a demo of a new product, a new application. And I remember getting a call from the salesman saying, Barbara, we're going to do this next Thursday. And, when the clients arrive, we want you to sit at the table and register them. And I was actually standing in an office on the phone, of course, a physical phone at that time, not a cell phone.
Right.
And I was in the middle, actually, of several secretaries in the organization. And I remember saying, Wayne, I'm your systems engineer. I'm not your secretary.
Good for you.
And actually, then I thought, oh, I have just said something in the middle of a group of women whose work I really value and respect. And so
boy. Yeah.
I made the point to Wayne and then hung up and apologized to them. And I suspect women my age who had the same experience also experienced what happens once you got to know a particular group of men or colleagues. Whether you're a man, a woman, or an alien from Mars, it really ends up being all about your credibility.
Good. Yeah, that's great. Good.
And so once you have the opportunity, and of course today we still have incredible systemic unintentional bias, and our experience the last few days with Black Lives Matter is just the biggest, most tragic example of that. So we still have the occasion we still need to be intentional, call it out, make the appropriate suggestions about how to become better, do better, improve.
Intentional. I like that. And I like that word. I'll give you an example of our own podcast of just how that applied to us. When we first started the podcast, all of the guests were guys. And it wasn't really like, I mean, I didn't sit down and go, okay, I'm going to have a podcast and only have guys on it. It's just, that's who my friends were. And that's
your network.
That was my network. Right. And so I just my friends started calling me saying, I'll come on the podcast. And I was like, okay, cool. And, then the next thing I knew, we had whatever it was, 15, 20 guests. And somebody pointed out, she has been a guest on the podcast, so I won't mention her name, but she called me and she goes, hey, you haven't had any female executives on your podcast, right? and I said, wow. I said, you're right. I remember thinking, damn, I didn't mean to do that, but yeah, I guess that has happened. And then we did have to make an intentional moves towards ensuring that we were aware of that and making moves to be more diversified in our guests. And now I think it's almost, we've had a bunch of now, great women on the podcast now, but I do remember thinking I need to be intentional about this or else it's just going to keep going this way. And we had to make moves to do it. And so I love that word. I do think that's important. I also, tell me if you agree with this. I think in some cases there's people, and I just use myself as an example, like they end up surrounding themselves with their network and it's all people that look like them, right? It's all either white males or whatever group they're in. And I think sometimes it's just like, that's their network. It's like they didn't really have a strategy or a mean intention. It's just happened. And then they're there and they're like, oh shit, I need to make some adjustments. What's your thoughts on that? What's your thoughts on that? Is that how it happens, kind of unintentionally, and then they need to be intentional about fixing it?
Yeah, I think we all form either professional or personal networks that are people who we know and like.
Yeah.
And that tends to be people who in some sense are like-minded or who we perceive to be like-minded.
Yeah.
And so that's what ends up with, for example, corporate public boards having only men. Fortunately, now there's incredible shareholder and institutional shareholder pressure to change that. There was an interesting data item that one of my colleagues with whom I work on getting more women on boards, there are more men named John who are board directors in corporate public boards than there are women in corporate public boards.
I have heard a bunch of stats like that. I've heard other, yeah. When I hear stuff like that, I'm just like, wow. I just can't even hardly believe it. But I think it's because I don't think about it, or I haven't made
No,
intentional moves to think about it or fix it.
that's exactly why you have to constantly make this intentionality present in what you're thinking about, talking about. And I want to bring this up to date for a minute to what we're doing in Rocky's Venture Club.
Go for it.
One of the things which is really interesting about RVC, and I think germane to our conversation today, RVC has mostly men investors. Maybe about 14 or 15% are women investors. And so, okay. However, the investments into ventures that have been made over the last 5 years, 50% of those investments in ventures are made in ventures that have women in the leadership team, founder, co-founder, CEO, COO.
Great.
And that particular result, so having a balanced portfolio, 50% women-led, 50% men-led, with a mostly deeply male set of investors is really unusual. And so I've been, over the last several years, as I've worked within RVC, tried to understand how this good result happens when it doesn't happen in other places with that same male-dominated demographic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think there's some helpful insights here.
How did you make it happen? Yeah, how did you go for it?
So the leadership team within RVC, Peter Adams, Dave Harris, have intentionally been active at trying to increase inclusion and diversity.
Great.
And so, for example, at our twice a year capital conferences, the speakers and the panels are balanced between men and women leaders in this early stage, community. So that's intentionality. The second one is there's a smaller group of men investors who are very clear and very experienced in investing in women-led companies. And when they are in the room with a group of other investors who have less of that experience, that eliminates a lot of the unintentional bias that would emerge if they weren't there.
Really good stuff. Congratulations on having that. Yeah, I bet there's very few that groups or organizations like RVC that have a 50-50 split like that on investments. I mean, great job. Congratulations.
I don't know of any. And I think there's one final distinction, or one final necessary but perhaps not sufficient condition. RVC, over the last 5 years with Peter and Dave's leadership, we have really focused on education, both for investors and for entrepreneurs. And by the time a woman or a man gets in front of our investor group seeking funding, they are credible. We have had the opportunity to run them through Pitch Academy, which we're doing this afternoon. Cool. We've probably worked with them, seen them, given them feedback over 6 months to a year. So the investors now know that there's not going to be a question of, is this a credible deal?
Yeah, but I love that. And by the way, that's exactly how we work at Riderflex, our recruiting firm. Like we have a super thorough vetting process that includes me video interviewing candidate finalists before we ever put them in front of the client. Right. And it's a very similar situation where we're just like, okay, if we're going to put a candidate in front of a client, they're going to be fully vetted. They're going to have the stamp of approval, and the client's going to feel very comfortable. Same thing. I think that's great. Can you, by the way, we didn't do this, so can you do this real quick? Can you give the listeners the 2 or 3 minute elevator, Rocky's Venture Club, and just tell them what go for it.
Absolutely. It's fascinating and important to understand this. Rocky's Venture Club is actually the longest running angel investing network organization in the country. It got started in the early 80s. And about 7 years ago, our current executive director, Peter, took it over. And its purpose is to create the community of active angel investors working with entrepreneurs to invest in these early stage companies, because we are confident that this is the best economic development leverage that these investor dollars can achieve. And so if we are able to attract any of your readers who are accredited, this is an SEC requirement that means you have to have either $1 million in assets, not including your personal residence, or about $200,000 in annual compensation.
And for the listeners, that's what they mean by accredited investor. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Just for the listeners? Okay.
Yes. Yes,
Great.
because the SEC realizes that this particular asset class is risky, and we don't want all of our citizens losing their residence on this venture. Having said that, I want to caveat that with, I think the common assumption that 9 out of 10 early stage companies fail is just really incorrect and misreads the actual data.
And by the way, what's the definition of failure too, right? Like, what does that mean? If they made it 3 years, well, does that mean they failed? I mean, what's the definition? I don't know.
Well, and I think that's one of the things that is important to understand. You have to sort of unpack this factoid, because when that particular metric is calculated, it's counting any registered business that stops being a business. And the awful part of that, because it creates this misunderstanding, is that, for example, in RVC, we create a limited liability corporation for every venture in which we invest.
Okay.
So that's a registered LLC, most likely in Colorado. When that company exits, which is very successful from our perspective, they get acquired, all the investors make money, that LLC is dead.
Yeah. And
it's over.
And they're counting these stats. Wow, I didn't know that. Wow.
That's one of the companies that failed in that count, which is why that count really is
interesting.
Not, it's a myth.
How many, can you give us details just real quick? So how many investments does RVC make a year on average, or do you want to give us any kind of stats?
And keep in mind that the typical investment in this angel stage is probably between 500,000 and $1.5 million.
Is that per individual? Or the group of angels that invested in a company?
That's a group of angels investing in a company.
Okay.
And if RVC is leading the deal for a local founder, for example, RVC investors might contribute some or all of that early stage investment. And we collaborate with other angel organizations across the country to fund companies in Colorado. So $1 invested by a local investor here can attract $4 or $5 from around the country into a Colorado venture.
And the typical target for the investment, the typical startup is, are they pre-revenue, after revenue? Are they 10 employees? Are they $1 million in revenue? What's the average?
It's usually a small number of employees. Typically might be at one end of the spectrum, just 2 or 3.
Okay.
They typically have some traction, and that can be revenue from customers, but it can also be, if you're a medical device, a clinical trial. It can be, we just did a funding round for an investment where the revenue was really quite small, but the number of users on the platform was 1 million.
Okay.
And so, that particular venture had taken a strategy to increase the brand loyalty and then begin to extrapolate on revenue.
What percentage of pitches do you invest in? So do you see a hundred people and one person? Yeah, what's your percentage? I'm just curious.
So over the year, those of us who are on the RVC staff, and that's Peter, Dave, Kevin, Emily, and me, we probably see between 1,500 and 2,000 ventures that come across our desk.
A year?
A year.
So that's, sorry, let's call it 2,000 pitch decks, but that's not 2,000 pitches.
No.
Okay.
And in fact, a number of those that come across might be really quite excellent future businesses, but maybe not attractive to an angel investor.
Okay.
It might be a company that has a very large capital requirement, so it might be appropriate for a different sort of financing.
Understood.
So of that 1,500 plus, we will have about 80 companies that pitch to investor groups.
Okay. And you guys,
so it's a pretty
all right.
steep funnel. And of that 80 that pitch to investor groups, 25 to 30 will actually get investment.
A year.
A year.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's all right. That's pretty heavy. I mean, that's pretty good.
Yeah.
That keeps you guys pretty damn busy.
Yeah, it does keep us very busy.
What's real quick? And I know you have like Pitch Academy, and I mean, we could do a 4-hour podcast on advice for founder pitches, but is there just a couple of favorite tips you want to give right here? If there's a couple of founders out there listening and they're preparing for their pitch deck and they're getting ready to go ask for some money, any quick tips you want to give them?
The most important tip is to get engaged in the overall angel community, investors and entrepreneurs. Get to know that community and get advice very early on that helps you create your business strategy in a way that could appeal to the investor. And the practical ways to do that, RVC offers a monthly mastermind. And if you're an entrepreneur member of RVC, it's a free event. If you're a non-member, I think it's $25 to sign up for this. It's a couple of hours. Every entrepreneur gets an opportunity to state a current challenge and get feedback both from RVC and from anyone else in the room about how to help them with that challenge.
Nice. Okay. Well, you know, what I heard you say there, a big piece of what I heard is, hey, you got to build relationships and get early input, early buy-in. Don't just come in completely cold with your own pitch deck that you haven't asked anybody for advice. You haven't talked to any of these angel guys ahead of time. And all of a sudden you're pitching. Like, don't do that.
No, it's you know, maybe there is 1 in 1,000 that can succeed that way, but for everybody else, it's really hard work.
Yeah.
And you want to get the best possible opportunity. And that means go to the workshops, go to Pitch Academy, go to the other workshops on financial strategy, business strategy, term sheets, so that you really do get to know. And those workshops are a combination of entrepreneurs and investors. So it's an incredible opportunity to get into the mix very easily.
What's the what are a couple of common reasons you see consistently on failure of a startup after they got some funding like this from RVC? Is it been do you see more commonly that it's the founders didn't get along, or maybe the CEO couldn't get out of his own way, or it was just a bad product? What are the common reasons?
I think there is a fairly typical scenario where sometimes founders, particularly if they may be the product innovator,
right,
may not actually be the best CEO ultimately.
Couldn't agree more.
And that's one of the bigger challenges. I think also one of the things we look for when we're evaluating a venture and a pitch is their go-to-market strategy, because they may have the best innovation in the world, the team may be fabulous, but if they really have not thought through how to capture customers and increase customers really and scale, that's a typical situation where you see a good idea that just doesn't go anywhere.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. I couldn't agree more. Yeah, you're dead on. I see that too. A founder that was a creator or an inventor
Yeah,
or the product person, that made I don't know, that made the new fancy coffee mug that does something special, right? Then they just can't, their egos or whatever, they just can't get out of the way. I mean, big advice for the listeners, you just surround yourself with people that have skill
yeah,
sets that you don't, and don't let your ego get in the way of the company scaling.
yeah.
It,
And your overall success.
yeah, right. I mean, big time. How about this? I want to ask you, you've been around, you have been yourself, and you've seen a ton of CEOs or presidents. Let's just
Yeah.
captain of the ship, whatever their title is. What would you say to somebody listening to this episode that just got that position, brand new into the captain's chair, first time they're listening to this episode, they've been in it for a few months? What would you tell them?
I would really reflect back on both my experiences working for leaders as well as my own experience as an executive leader, and thinking about times when I was more successful and times when I was less successful. And I think the common denominator is listening skills.
Yes, please. Thank you. I want to just take a pause right there. I just did a podcast tip episode on this on the Riderflex podcast just recently. Yes, yes, yes. They spend all this time talking to get to be promoted, and then once they get promoted, they forget to stop talking and listen to the. Oh, I'm
Yeah.
sorry. Sorry,
You
I don't mean to rant on that, but oh yeah, go ahead.
Well, and I want to reflect on one personal experience. I did a startup out in the Bay Area from 90 to 94, 95, and then I came back and worked for US West again. And I was given an opportunity to take on several parts of US West's IT organization that, for a variety of reasons, had some challenges and problems. And they were in functional domains that I did not have much personal background and experience on. And so I was very clear that I was the new kid on the block relative to that functional area. And my only choice was to listen. And I had that job over 5 years, and gradually increased the size of the organization because my boss at the time, the CIO of US West, realized that I was fairly good at taking organizations that, for whatever reason, weren't finely tuned and getting them to a point where there was a better result or better output. And because I had a 5-year tenure in that role and position, I was really able to promote from within. And the leadership team at the end of that 5 years was probably one of the most profound and pleasurable and satisfying organizations that I have ever worked with. And to this day, we stay in touch. We would lay across a railroad tie for each other.
That's awesome.
And whatever the challenge was, we would take it on, and as a team, we'd figure out how to do it.
Very good.
It was just phenomenal, and those are rare experiences.
They are, really, they are. You're right. The listening piece, and that's not just for first-time CEOs. That's advice for any CEO listening. I mean, even if you've been in the chair for a while, you have to remind yourself, you hired all these expensive executives to be on your leadership team to help you. You have to listen. You have to grab their advice, get their input. It's really bad. I see it pretty common when the CEO was the original founder, or like you mentioned earlier, was the person that built the product and the original founder is still involved. That's when it's really bad. They just, very common,
their baby.
Right.
and when you're a mother or a parent, you know best. And so it's very hard to let go of that.
I had I won't mention his name. He's been a guest on the podcast. I was mentoring him a little bit because I ran a few companies before I started Riderflex and had some CEO and president experience. And I was having my third breakfast with him. And I'll just call him Johnny for this particular exercise. His name's not Johnny. And I said, Johnny, I said, listen, I said, I'm going to tell you what your biggest opportunity is. You just don't listen. I said, this is our third breakfast. You bring me here for mentoring. That's what the meeting's supposed to be. And 90% of the time you're talking.
Yeah.
I said, if that's how you're treating your leadership team, you're not going to grow as fast, and you're missing, and I gave him the whole speech.
Yeah.
About 6 months later, he called me. He goes, man, I just want to tell you, he goes, that's the best advice anybody gave me in a long time about being a CEO. And it's really good for the listeners to just, I just want to challenge any CEO listening to this, any president of any company, just monitor yourself in leadership meetings, monitor yourself during touch bases, and just to ask yourself, how much are you listening and asking questions versus telling? So anyway, I know we're getting closer to wrap up here, and I want to ask you a couple of other questions about just life experiences, because you've just had, like I said, really impressive career. And I admire the fact that you are not just playing golf somewhere or on a cruise ship or on an island. You're still just getting up every day, getting after it, after this career that you've had, which I really admire. Your energy at this stage in your career is exceptional, something to be super proud of.
I am delighted by it. Actually, it's an artifact perhaps of good health, but it's also, I've tried retiring a couple of times, and it's not nearly as exciting as working with people who are really purpose driven.
Yeah.
And so I think my good health probably is a result of the opportunity I have to work with incredible colleagues and on important work.
Do you know how many people I meet your age that have their LinkedIn profiles up to date, that are still engaged in a job, that are still energetic, that are still mentoring and motivating, and oh, by the way, have the guts to actually put the year they graduated college on their profile? Do you know how many people I meet like that? Like,
no.
Nobody. Nobody. I love that about you. When I was doing my homework on her, I'm like, look at this, man. I just love her. She's just like, hey, this is who I am. This is where I'm at in life, and I'm still here, and I'm still producing. I love it. On that note, if you could call that young lady coming out of,
school
of Kansas with that physics degree. By the way, we can't ever go to happy hour because your IQ, being a physics major compared to mine, I'll feel like everything I'm saying is stupid. No, if you could call that young lady coming out of Kansas, KU, and tell her anything, if you could go back in time and have that conversation and call her and say, hey, Barbara, listen, what would you tell her?
I think one of the most important things I would say is that life is an experience, and you should not limit that. And one of the ways in which it's most important to expand that is to travel, and if possible, earlier in your career than I did. I did not live and work abroad until about 6 years ago. And so I wish I had had that opportunity much earlier in my career, because the world is a fascinating and complicated place, and you can't read enough to inform yourself about how the world works. You need to go and see it on someone else's turf.
I love that. That's really good. I really, that's great stuff. On that note, I recently interviewed somebody that said, hey, I just lived in a third world country for the last 5 years, and it changed my life.
Exactly. Yes.
He was telling me, he's like, for example, when you run out of milk, you just go down to the store and get a gallon of milk and you don't even think about it. He goes, it's not like that everywhere else.
No, no. And when I left my last big corporate job, which was at Storage Tech after they had merged with Sun, I decided I would not go back into a corporate role, and I would do international consulting as long as it was about business or education.
Love it.
And I ended up doing just some sort of small gigs in Vietnam and started traveling in Southeast Asia, and ultimately ended up traveling in Myanmar.
Love it.
And after a few years of doing odd jobs around Southeast Asia, sort of short consulting, I worked for a Norwegian impact investing company for 4 years in Myanmar, right at the time when all the policy reforms were changing and right in the middle of their first national elections. And it was an extraordinary opportunity to see a developing country, very rich in natural resources, but very poor in government processes and support for their citizens and population, and learn about education and healthcare and food supply and economic realities. And of course, on a funny anecdote, the banking system when I moved there was really quite immature. And if you lease an apartment or a flat, you have to pay the rent 12 months in advance in cash.
Wow.
Yes, which actually is a huge detriment to small business growth because you have to have the capital up front for 12 months of your lease expense. And so there was a foreign exchange bank there. I had accounts in the Myanmar currency chat and an account in US dollars. And when I needed to pay the rent on an office or a flat, I would have to take out literally bags full of Myanmar currency and hire these very strong but very small Myanmar young men to physically carry it on their shoulders to wherever I was meeting with the landlord.
Wow.
So yeah, I would bring $10,000 in brand new crisp US Treasury dollars on the plane over to Myanmar, in order to actually fill that bank account.
Yeah, if you get a chance to work overseas in some projects like that, yeah, it'll definitely open your eyes to some things for sure.
Yeah.
I know we only have like 6 minutes here. I'm going to ask you one more question.
Sure.
And I think the answer to this question changes as you move through life. So if you had to define your core purpose in life as you wake up every day now, and you're kind of, we all, I think all of us to some degree, sometimes we have these thoughts like, okay, so what am I doing on this planet? What's my purpose? At this stage in your career and your life now, how would you define your core purpose?
I think I would say what has meant the most to me and been the most satisfying is solving problems. However that might be defined. It can certainly, when I was in school would have been some sort of, homework problem. But in the larger context of working and being part of communities, whether professional communities or neighborhoods or whatever, I think I'm actually good at taking a look at the sort of situation and figuring out something that I can do that can make it better for that community, whatever that is.
Nice.
And it isn't always a very big thing. It's most frequently a fairly small thing, because I think most progress sort of does occur just one little bit at a time.
Isn't that the truth? Very good. Barbara, thank you so much for being on the Riderflex podcast. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
By the way, if one of your angel investors is having coffee with you and they say, I just want to put a bunch of money into a small recruiting firm, will you make sure you mention Riderflex? The Riderflex podcast features entrepreneurs, business executives, and the stories behind how they got there, as well as daily tips on career advice and job interviews. Our show can be heard just about anywhere these days, but you can visit riderflex.com and click on the podcast page to hear all the previous episodes and learn more about the recruiting and consulting services we provide. Contact us at the email address info@riderflex.com or 888-964-5876. Thanks so much for listening, and if you enjoy our show, please be sure to subscribe to our channel and like the episodes.